Hello, everyone. I'm going to be talking about Storybook, so a story about Storybook. So what are we going to be talking about today is who I am, what Storybook is, why you should use it, how it works, how did all this come to be, what my role in that was, and I'm going to give you some insight on how Storybook is maintained and developed. And then to finish off, I'll show you some of the upcoming features that we're working on. So my name is Norbert Langen. I work as a front-end consultant for a company in the Netherlands called Xebia. And during my off time, I work on Storybook, which is an open source project. So what is that? In its own wording, Storybook is the UI development environment that you will love to use. And there's a reason why you'll love to use it. It's because at its core, it implements isolated component-driven development. So what is isolated component-driven development? Well, I'm at a React conference, so I don't have to explain what components are. And I don't have to explain that components encapsulate a piece of UI. But oftentimes, when you're developing your application, you have this tendency to create the application first and then create components in it and components in that. And you will reach a state where it's hard to reach a certain component, to develop and view a certain component. Imagine a component that only gets shown when there's a 500 error, or whenever a user makes a certain action that takes a lot of steps. If you develop using the app-first approach, it will become harder for you to reach that component. So when you do isolated component-driven development, you want something to be able to view all your components in all their possible states without having to click and go through and fill form fields, etc. So view components in isolation is the first feature of Storybook, and the second is to be able to pass in any props or settings for this component and view it that way. The third is that you can see any actions or callbacks that are called. You should be able to tweak the properties and the settings and the context at runtime in this UI development environment and see those changes immediately. And since it's for developers, we implement hot module reloading, obviously. So you change your code in your editor, and we swap out the component at runtime. But also, we swap out the stories or the settings that you change. So in Storybook, you write a list, you describe your component in a list of states. And so when you add a state, we add it immediately using hot module reloading as well. Not everyone's setup is the same. So using our extendable configuration, you would be able to use Preact, for example. But you can also use CSS modules or styled components, add any Babel or Webpack configuration to your liking. And Storybook is a really good tool for helping people onboard on your project as well. Because all those components are laid out in a flat way, it's explorable which components are already there and how they look and how they interact. So you can view all the components and list them and search for them, and you can add documentation alongside those components as well. So this is how Storybook looks. It has a UI and a preview. And inside this preview, which is an iframe, so your component, your JavaScript, and your CSS is actually encapsulated in this iframe. Media queries work, for example. So how does this work? So we call this outer shell, we call the manager. This manager is in control of which story is to be selected, and it's in control of the add-on API. And the preview, that's the part that you can see in the middle, that runs in its own iframe, And it can actually be all sorts of things. The add-on panel on the right, you can see here, those are React components that you can write on your own, yourself. And so you can extend Storybook to do whatever you want. I'm showing here an add-on called knobs, which allows you to change the properties of your being rendered component at runtime. And interestingly, this preview is not tied to React only. So we also can support other frameworks as well. Because this problem of component-driven development and being able to view all components, that's not really React specific, is it? So internally, what happens is that there's a selection event. So now we know which story to display, and we hand this information to all the add-ons. The add-ons are able to respond to this and change any of the properties, for example. This data is then sent via post message to the iframe, which then can get the right story and render it using the right properties. So a bit of a history lesson, what happened. I am not the original author of Storybook. It was originally developed internally at a company called Kadira, which was a startup, which unfortunately at 2017 shut down. And with it, they kind of shut down Storybook as well. But it was an open source project, and it was quite popular. So the community was asked, like, should we maintain it ourselves? And so I was kind of involved with Storybook. I was trying to make an add-on for it. And I posted in a issue like, oh, maybe I can help maintain it. And then I went to bed. And then the next morning, I was administrator on the repository. Together with 3 other people. And so I got interactive on the Storybook Slack, and I was trying to find the other people and see who would be really interested in maintaining it. Because it was 25 or more repositories scattered all over the place. Maintaining this thing would be quite hard. So what do? I opened a Google Hangout for anyone to join, and we had a discussion of almost an hour about who we were, what we were doing, why we were using Storybook, and what we could do to contribute to Storybook. So things kind of got started from there, and it really got into a really vibrant community. So what did I do? Well, this is my notorious PR, adding 1,649 commits to a repository, adding 45,000 lines of code. I migrated those 25 plus repositories into one. Somehow I got 3 people to sign off on that. So I do quite a bit of technical work on the Storybook codebase, but I think my time is like 50-50 spent on onboarding new people or helping people, supporting developers, and doing actual Storybook development. So here's an example of me acting like an open source maintainer who wants other open source maintainers. Someone opens an issue asking for support for something, and instead of thinking like, well, this is probably 10 lines of code, it will probably take me an evening to do, I try to get this person to do it and get them involved in development of Storybook. And this might take still an evening, like onboarding someone, helping them understand the code base. But overall, if someone's onboarded on the project, in the long term, that will help me out, so I don't have to do everything alone. So another thing that I've been doing is because I really realized that this problem that we're solving with Storybook is not React only. I reached out to other communities as well. So here's me reaching out to the Vue community. Vue Play was a project that someone made in Vue that was a Storybook clone. And this is not me thinking that they were a Storybook clone. This was them proclaiming to be one. They had the same UI, but implemented in Vue, and they had the same functionality, but they didn't have any add-ons or compatibility with our add-ons. So I looked into the code base of a Storybook, and I discovered that actually we can render anything in this iframe, and it just takes about 50 or 100 differences in lines of code. So we can support Vue quite easily. And via this post, I got one of the Vue core maintainers to help us maintain Storybook, and a Storybook for Vue version was launched 4 months ago. I'm also active on Twitter and other chat applications. I almost started to collect chat applications at this point. And yeah, I'm trying to reach out to the community, people who are using Storybook or are considering using Storybook. And I try to advise them on where Storybook is really good at and where maybe you should go for an alternative like React styleguide jest. So this is how popular Storybook is. The red line is the previous version maintained by Kadira, or actually not maintained anymore. And the blue line is the version 3 that we as a community are maintaining. At its peak, that's 47,000 installs in a day. So how is it maintained? Well, we are active a lot on Slack. I think the Storybook Slack is more active than the company Slack that I'm on. And I try to employ a methodology that is called open source. So this means that I will have as a first directive, I would say, to onboard new people versus satisfying all the needs of all the users, myself, or helping them myself. I try to help them help themselves. And this has resulted in currently 56 main contributors or main maintainers on the Storybook organization on GitHub. Not all of these people are active every day, and I don't want them to. They have their own personal life, just like me. But it results in 100 merge PRs every month. And a lot of contributors. Some of them are like one-off contributors, but I would reach out to someone on Slack after like a few weeks, like, is there some other thing that you would like to work on? Get them enthusiastic on something else. Trying to give them a goal. So some technical details on how Storybook is maintained. We use Yarn a lot. Who are here are using Yarn? If you've migrated back to NPM 5 because it was fast, that's not really the only thing Yarn can do for you. Yarn is a really good solution if you're maintaining an open source project, especially if it's a monolithic repository. So let's talk about monolithic repositories. First, a normal repository looks somewhat like this. You've got some source, you've got some node modules, and you've got a package JSON. In a monolithic repository, you have multiple of that in one repository. So there's maybe a package JSON at the root, but it's not really what you're going to be publishing. And then what you want to do is not install node modules multiple times, right? So you try to install them as high as possible. And this is something that Yarn can do for you. It can look at your code base like that and install the node modules as high as possible. So it's called hoisting. So going from the previous graph to what Storybook looks in a graph, and this is not all of it, we have all of those previous 25 repositories are still 25 plus packages on NPM that we publish. So we still have those in our code base, but now they're all together, and it's much easier to find things and change things as a whole. So during development, we actually use Storybook ourselves. We run a Storybook example, and we use one of the apps. So our apps, for example, is React or React Native or Vue. And we use our own add-ons during development. So I would say that this is sort of like a dog feeding or dog food methodology. And we're using like really awesome tools. If you're interested in learning these tools, come check out the Storybook codebase. We're getting some sponsorship. I really like to thank Netlify and circleCI for their great services. So let's finish off with some future features. As I've kind of hinted at, I want Storybook to be a facto solution for any framework. Whether you're using Vue or some obscure thing, if you want Storybook for your platform, come talk to me and we'll build it together. So if you have any of these and Storybook's not available, let's work it together. I'm currently working with one of the core Aurelia maintainers, and I'm also working with some Polymer people to create a Polymer version. So we also want to improve our own documentation. I think for a living, vibrant community, documentation is vital. But as developers ourselves, we kind of want to focus on features, right? So this is something that's really hard on our roadmap, and it's something that I've been working on myself to create a new, cool documentation site that will be able to, where you can select your own framework and then see code examples in this framework. But documenting Storybook and how to use it is not enough. We also want to make Storybook better to have your own documentation in it. So you want to document how to use components and how they work. Sometimes you don't want to see a single component, but you want to see a whole list of components. So these are things that we're working on. So currently where Storybook is really good at is slightly more to the development gradient of where it's good at. But we want to make it better for more use cases using that. And I'm also interested in unit testing integrations. Actually, this is how I got into Storybook. I was trying to make a jest integration. So just last week, this is what I published as an add-on for Storybook. It shows you your jest output in a nice format. I didn't do that alone. I had great contributors. Renaud is, sorry, I can't remember his last name, but he started it, and we kind of finished it together. So that makes it a little bit better for the development side of things. And to end off, like this is where I think the end state of where Storybook is going. It's an epic that I call Customizability. So I want our UI to be themable, but theming is just swapping a few colors around or changing some paddings. I want full customizability, and the way I think I'm going to be implementing that is by allowing you to swap any of our manager UI components for your own or wrap it, and that way you can inject any add-on at any place. And I'm also working on a better layout system, so it's not just an add-on panel on the right or on the bottom, but you can just have as many add-on panels as you want anywhere. So that expands the use cases of Storybook. And obviously, you can help. This is open source software, so I'm really keen to having and getting help, getting contributors. So if you want to help on GitHub, that's awesome. You can also join our Slack. If you're a company and you're using Storybook, you can consider donating on our Open Collective. We're currently not doing much with Open Collective right now, but we're having it and hoping to be able to contribute back to the community, like ordering stickers or T-shirts, or maybe even at some point when we reach like Webpack levels of donating, we can actually pay contributors. So that's my talk. Thank you. If you have any questions, I don't know how much time I have.